The boardroom fell silent as Amelia placed the marriage license on the polished mahogany table with a deliberate click that echoed like a gavel. "Grace and I are not just business partners," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We are wives." Gasps rippled through the 12 men and 2 women seated around the long table at Vanguard Enterprises headquarters on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. Grace stood shoulder to shoulder with her dark eyes locked on the chairman, Mr. Harrington, whose face twisted from shock to contempt. The air thickened with the scent of expensive cologne and sudden hostility. Outside the glass walls, the New York skyline glittered under a gray October sky, but inside the room the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amelia had rehearsed this moment for weeks, yet nothing prepared her for the immediate wave of ridicule. Harrington let out a short, bitter laugh. "This is some kind of joke, right? The 2 heiresses of one of the largest private equity firms in America waltzing in here to announce they're lesbians? The press will eat us alive and the investors will flee." Several board members nodded, murmuring agreements, while others stared at their phones, already typing frantic messages. Grace's hand brushed Amelia's under the table, a tiny gesture no one else could see, but it anchored her. They had built Vanguard together after their father's sudden death 3 years ago, inheriting equal shares and co-CEO titles against the board's quiet objections. The old guard had always preferred the idea of male successors, even though none existed in the family line. Now the secret they had guarded since Harvard Business School was out in the open. Their private ceremony in a quiet Massachusetts town 3 months earlier had been beautiful and risk-free until today. Amelia felt the familiar knot in her stomach, the one that appeared every time ambition clashed with the love she felt for Grace. She had clawed her way to the top of every class, every deal, every negotiation, because weakness was never an option. Grace, on the other hand, had always balanced her drive with a softer core, believing that success didn't have to destroy everything personal. Their late-night arguments about coming out had grown sharper in recent months, until Amelia finally convinced her that hiding was no longer sustainable. "They can't fire us for being married," Amelia had said. "The bylaws protect the heirs." But looking at the faces around the table, she wondered if she had miscalculated the depth of their prejudice. The meeting dragged on with pointed questions that felt more like accusations. "How long has this been going on?" one director demanded. "Does this affect your judgment on the upcoming merger?" Another asked, his tone dripping with doubt. Grace answered each one with calm precision, citing performance numbers and legal precedents, while Amelia watched the room calculating alliances and weaknesses. By the time they adjourned, the stock price had already dipped 2% on leaked rumors. Outside the building, reporters swarmed the lobby shouting questions about the lesbian heiresses and family values at Vanguard. That evening, in their penthouse overlooking Central Park, Amelia poured 2 glasses of Cabernet and handed one to Grace. The city lights twinkled below, but the mood inside was heavy. "They laughed at us," Grace said quietly, her voice cracking for the first time all day. "Like our love is a punchline." Amelia pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "They always underestimated us. That's their mistake, not ours." Yet even as she said it, Amelia felt the cold calculation creeping in, the part of her that wondered whether public honesty had just cost them the empire they had sacrificed everything to build. The night stretched long with whispered promises and unspoken fears, but sleep came late and restless for both of them. The next morning, the board called an emergency session. Amelia and Grace arrived together dressed in matching charcoal suits, a subtle show of unity. Harrington opened with a motion to review their leadership fitness, citing reputational risk. The vote was close, but the motion passed. For the first time since inheriting the company, the 2 women faced the real possibility of being stripped of power. Grace squeezed Amelia's hand under the table again, but this time Amelia didn't squeeze back. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, scanning the bylaws in her mind, searching for the loophole that would turn ridicule into victory. The game had changed, and only one of them truly understood how high the stakes had become. The emergency session stretched into the afternoon, with lawyers called in to review the family trust documents. Amelia sat perfectly still, her mind racing through every clause she had memorized during sleepless nights after their father's funeral. Grace beside her maintained a composed facade, but Amelia could feel the tension radiating from her, the way her breathing quickened whenever Harrington's voice rose in accusation. "This marriage exposes the firm to boycotts from conservative clients," he argued, gesturing at projected slides of declining investor inquiries. "We have a duty to protect shareholder value, not personal lifestyles." The room murmured agreement, and Amelia watched as two longtime allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Outside the windows, rain began to fall, streaking the glass like tears. Grace leaned over during a break, whispering, "Maybe we should have waited. The merger with Apex is too important." Amelia shook her head, barely moving her lips. Waiting would have meant hiding forever. "We built this together, Grace. We don't back down now." But inside her chest a different voice whispered doubts. She had always been the strategist, the one who saw the board as chess pieces while Grace saw them as people. Their love had survived secret years at Harvard, late-night study sessions, stolen weekends in the Hamptons, and the crushing pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar empire. Now that love was being weaponized against them. By 3 o'clock the board proposed a compromise, a 6-month review period, during which Amelia and Grace would step back from public representation while the firm rebranded around traditional values. The suggestion was insulting, and Amelia felt her temper flare for the first time. "You're asking us to hide who we are to save your precious image," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We own 51% combined. The will is clear." Harrington smiled thinly. "The will says nothing about public scandals. We can challenge the succession if we prove undue influence or moral unfitness." The threat hung in the air, heavy and legal. That night the two women returned to the penthouse exhausted. Grace poured wine again, but this time her hands trembled. "I love you, Amelia. But I'm scared. What if they take everything?" Amelia pulled her onto the couch, holding her close. "They won't. I've been reading the bylaws every night since Dad died. There's a clause about co-heir voting rights that no one has ever tested." She didn't mention the private meeting she had scheduled with their corporate counsel earlier that day, or the discreet calls to minority shareholders who owed her favors. Grace kissed her softly, a moment of tenderness that reminded Amelia why she had risked it all. Yet as they lay in bed later, Amelia stared at the ceiling, calculating percentages and alliances while Grace's breathing slowed into sleep. Love was the reason they were fighting, but survival might require sacrifices Grace wasn't ready to make. The following week the media storm intensified. Tabloids ran headlines about the lesbian heiresses of Wall Street, and conservative investors pulled funding from 2 pending deals. Grace suggested they issue a joint statement softening their stance, but Amelia refused. "Softening means weakness. We double down." Their argument escalated in the kitchen one evening, voices rising for the first time in years. Grace accused Amelia of caring more about power than their marriage. Amelia countered that without power they would lose the life they had built together. In the end they reconciled with quiet apologies and shared tears, but the crack had formed. Amelia began working late reviewing confidential share ledgers while Grace focused on damage control with the public relations team. Unbeknownst to Grace, Amelia had already initiated the first step of her plan. She met privately with 3 key minority shareholders in a discreet midtown restaurant, explaining how the current board's conservatism was costing the firm millions. "A unified front under the co-heirs protects your returns," she argued, sliding across documents that showed projected growth if the merger succeeded without interference. One by one they nodded, signing preliminary agreements to vote with the heirs in any emergency motion. Amelia returned home that night with the taste of victory on her tongue, but the weight of secrecy on her shoulders. Grace greeted her with a warm embrace, unaware that the woman she loved had just begun playing a game where loyalty might become the ultimate casualty. The quarterly earnings call became the next battleground. Amelia and Grace sat side by side in the executive conference room, facing a wall of cameras while analysts dialed in from across the country. The numbers were strong, but the questions quickly turned personal. How do you respond to claims that your personal relationship is distracting from fiduciary duties? One analyst asked. Grace answered with measured grace, citing record profits and the successful integration of 3 new portfolio companies. Amelia added data points on market expansion, her tone ice cold and professional. Yet behind the scenes the board had already begun courting dissident shareholders, promising stability in exchange for support. Grace noticed the subtle shifts first. Board members who once nodded at her ideas now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Amelia, on the other hand, seemed energized, spending hours in her private office with the door closed. "What are you working on?" Grace asked one evening, finding Amelia surrounded by legal pads covered in flowcharts. "Just protecting us." Amelia replied, kissing her forehead. The kiss felt distant. That weekend they escaped to their Hamptons house, hoping the ocean air would heal the growing distance. They walked the beach hand in hand, talking about the early days at Harvard when their rivalry had turned into something deeper during a late-night study session on corporate governance. I fell in love with your mind first, Grace said, smiling for the first time in days. Amelia squeezed her hand, but her eyes scanned the horizon, already planning the next board maneuver. Monday brought the first betrayal. A trusted director leaked an internal memo to the press suggesting the co-COs were emotionally compromised. The stock dropped another 3%. Grace confronted Amelia in the car after a tense investor lunch. Did you know this was coming? Amelia hesitated, then nodded. I anticipated it. That's why I've been securing proxies. Grace's eyes widened. Without telling me? The argument that followed was quiet but devastating. Grace accused Amelia of treating their marriage like another deal. Amelia countered that someone had to make the hard choices. They drove home in silence, and for the first time Grace slept in the guest room. The next morning Amelia woke to an empty bed, and a note from Grace saying she needed space to think. Panic gripped her, not the emotional kind but the strategic kind. Without Grace's signature on the proxy documents, the plan would collapse. She spent the day calling in favors, meeting with their father's old attorney, who confirmed the existence of an obscure clause in the trust allowing co-heirs to form a voting bloc that could override board motions if both agreed in writing. Amelia drafted the agreement that night alone in the penthouse, her pen moving with cold precision. When Grace returned late that evening looking exhausted, Amelia slid the document across the kitchen island. This binds our shares together permanently. No board can touch us if we sign. Grace read it slowly, her face unreadable. It also means we can never sell or split without the other's consent. It's forever, Amelia. Amelia reached for her hand. That's the point. Forever with you and with the company. Grace signed, but the warmth had faded from her eyes. The following week the board called another vote, this time on removing the co-COs from day-to-day operations. The motion was expected to pass until Amelia stood and announced they had secured enough proxies to block it. The room erupted. Harrington demanded proof. Amelia calmly projected the signed agreements onto the screen. Several board members turned pale, realizing the balance of power had shifted overnight. Grace sat beside her, silent but present, her hand resting lightly on Amelia's knee in a show of unity that felt more like performance than partnership. That night the victory tasted bitter. They celebrated with champagne on the balcony, but the conversation stayed surface level. Grace praised the strategy, yet her eyes held questions she didn't voice. Amelia knew she had crossed a line by moving without full disclosure, but she also knew it had saved them both. The board was rattled but not defeated. Whispers of legal challenges and shareholder lawsuits began circulating. Amelia lay awake long after Grace fell asleep, calculating the next move. The share agreement was their shield, but it had also become a chain linking their love and their ambition in ways neither had fully anticipated. The legal challenges arrived faster than expected. Within 48 hours, 3 major investors filed suit claiming the proxy block violated fiduciary standards. Amelia spent 14-hour days in strategy sessions with their top attorneys, while Grace handled the public narrative, issuing statements about inclusive leadership that carefully avoided the word marriage. The media frenzy intensified, with morning shows debating whether the lesbian heiresses represented progress or a threat to corporate America. Grace watched the coverage alone one afternoon, tears slipping down her cheeks as pundits questioned their competence. When Amelia finally came home at midnight, she found Grace on the couch surrounded by tissues. "I'm losing myself in this fight," Grace whispered. Amelia held her, promising it would end soon, but both knew the promise was fragile. Inside the boardroom the atmosphere had turned poisonous. Harrington circulated a petition calling for an independent review of the co-heir voting clause. Amelia countered by quietly purchasing additional shares through a shell company she controlled, leveraging personal funds she had never disclosed even to Grace. The move was risky and borderline ethical, but it pushed their combined control to 54%. When Grace discovered the transaction during a routine audit, she confronted Amelia in the executive elevator. "You used our joint account without telling me. That's not partnership, that's control." Amelia didn't deny it. It was necessary. They were about to freeze our voting rights. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped out smiling for the staff, but the silence between them stretched like a chasm. Grace began spending more time at their foundation, focusing on women's leadership programs, a safe space away from the boardroom toxicity. Amelia respected the distance, but it hurt in ways she hadn't expected. One evening she drove to the foundation unannounced and found Grace mentoring a group of young executives. Watching her speak with passion and warmth reminded Amelia of the woman she had fallen in love with, the one who believed success could include humanity. After the session they walked together through the quiet hallways. "I miss us," Amelia said simply. Grace stopped and turned. "I miss the version of you who didn't treat our love like a tactical asset." The words stung, but Amelia knew they were true. The lawsuit hearings began the following week in a packed Manhattan courtroom. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened as Harrington's team argued that the marriage created an inherent conflict of interest. Amelia's attorneys countered with performance metrics and the ironclad language of the trust. During a recess, Grace pulled Amelia aside in the marble hallway. "Whatever happens today, I need you to promise we come first after this." Amelia hesitated, the strategist in her calculating the cost of such a promise. "I promise," she said finally, but the pause had been noticeable. Back in court, the judge ruled in their favor, citing the clear intent of the founding documents. The board's petition was dismissed and the proxy block upheld. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Amelia and Grace faced the cameras together, hands clasped in a show of solidarity. "Today justice prevailed for fair governance," Amelia stated. Grace added, "and for the right to lead without prejudice." That night they returned to the penthouse, exhausted but victorious. They made love for the first time in weeks, a quiet, tender reconnection that felt like healing. Yet as Amelia drifted to sleep, she knew the real battle was far from over. The board members who remained were cornered animals now, and cornered animals bit hardest. Grace's breathing was steady beside her, but Amelia lay awake wondering how much more their love could endure before the weight of ambition crushed it completely. The board's retaliation came in the form of a leaked internal audit questioning the valuation of several portfolio companies under the COSOS watch. The timing was deliberate, coinciding with the final stages of the Apex merger. Amelia recognized the tactic immediately, an attempt to erode investor confidence and force a no-confidence vote. She spent 3 straight days in the war room with analysts rebuilding every financial model, while Grace worked the phones reassuring key clients. The strain showed. Grace's usual warmth had been replaced by brittle efficiency, and Amelia's once sharp focus was now edged with exhaustion. During a late-night strategy session, Grace finally voiced the fear that had been growing. "What if we walk away? Sell our stakes, take the money, and build something new, just us?" Amelia stared at her across the conference table, the proposal hitting like a physical blow. "Walk away? After everything we've survived?" Grace's voice was soft but firm. "I'd rather have you than the company, Amelia. The board wins if we destroy each other trying to beat them." The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Amelia felt the familiar cold calculation rise, but this time it battled against something deeper, the memory of Grace's smile on their wedding day, the way her hand fit perfectly in hers. For the first time the strategist faltered. The next morning Amelia made a decision that surprised even herself. She called an emergency board meeting, and for the first time in months entered the room without a pre-planned script. "We're prepared to offer a new share structure," she announced, sliding printed agreements across the table. The document outlined a voluntary dilution of their voting block in exchange for permanent seats on the board and veto power over any leadership changes. It also included a clause requiring all board members to sign a diversity and inclusion charter or face immediate resignation. The room went deathly quiet. Harrington's face turned purple. "You're blackmailing us with our own company." Amelia met his eyes without blinking. "No. I'm offering survival. Sign and the merger proceeds. Refuse and we exercise our full voting rights to replace half this board." Grace watched in stunned silence as one by one the directors signed. The share agreement they had crafted in secret months earlier now served as both shield and sword. It bound the board's hands while preserving the co-heirs' control without the appearance of tyranny. When the last signature was secured, Amelia turned to Grace, her eyes softening for the first time in weeks. "I chose us," she whispered as they left the room. The merger closed 2 days later, sending the stock soaring and silencing every critic. The board members who had once mocked them now sat in meetings with forced politeness, avoiding any mention of personal lives. That weekend they flew to a private island off the coast of Maine, the first real vacation in years. Walking along the rocky shore, Grace stopped and pulled Amelia close. "You scared me," she admitted. "For a while I thought the company had won." Amelia kissed her forehead, tasting salt from the sea air. "It almost did. But you reminded me what winning actually means." They stood together watching the waves, the weight of months of tension finally lifting. Yet Amelia knew the peace was fragile. The board was subdued, but the power dynamics had permanently shifted, and with them the balance in their marriage. The months that followed brought a new normal. Vanguard thrived under the restructured board, with the Apex merger delivering record returns. Public perception shifted from scandal to admiration as business magazines ran features on the power couple reshaping Wall Street. Amelia and Grace appeared together at charity galas and industry conferences, their marriage no longer a liability, but a quiet statement of strength. Yet behind closed doors the scars remained. Grace had grown more cautious with her trust, while Amelia had learned to consult her on every major decision, even when instinct screamed otherwise. Their love had survived, but it had been tempered by fire. One crisp November evening they hosted a small dinner for the remaining loyal board members in their penthouse. The atmosphere was polite, almost cordial. Harrington raised a glass in a toast that felt more like surrender than celebration. To the future of Vanguard under its rightful leaders. Amelia clinked her glass with his, noting the defeat in his eyes. Later, as the guests departed, Grace stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. Amelia joined her, slipping a cashmere shawl over her shoulders. "We did it," she said softly. Grace turned, smiling, but her eyes held a shadow. "We did. But at what cost?" Amelia had no easy answer. She thought of the sleepless nights, the arguments, the moments when ambition had nearly eclipsed love. The share agreement that had silenced the board now served as a daily reminder of how close they had come to losing everything that mattered. Grace took her hand, and they stood together watching the city pulse below. "I still choose you," Grace whispered. "Every day, even when it's hard." Amelia pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent that had grounded her through every crisis. The wind carried the distant sounds of traffic and sirens, but in that moment the world felt smaller, safer. Yet as they prepared for bed, Amelia's mind drifted to the future. The board was quiet for now, but new challenges would arise: younger executives, hungrier rivals, international expansions. She wondered whether their hard-won balance could withstand the next storm. Grace sensed her distraction and turned off the light, drawing her closer. "Stop calculating," she murmured with a gentle laugh. "Just be here with me." Amelia smiled in the darkness, letting the strategist rest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that love and power could coexist without one devouring the other. The following spring, at the annual shareholder meeting, Amelia and Grace stood together on stage addressing a packed auditorium. The applause was genuine this time. As they stepped down from the podium, hands linked, Amelia glanced at Grace and saw the same quiet strength that had first drawn her in at Harvard. The journey had changed them both, forging something stronger than either could have imagined. The board watched from the front row, faces carefully neutral. The share agreement had done its job, silencing opposition and securing their legacy. True or false? In the cutthroat world of corporate America, love can survive ambition only when one partner is willing to risk everything for the other.